Before online shopping and modern malls took over, one name defined American retail: JCPenney. At its peak, it was the undisputed king and the largest department store chain in the United States. But how did a single small-town dry goods shop grow into an absolute retail empire, and what led to its dramatic fall? Let's begin with the brand's founder. James Cash Penney was born in 1875 near Hamilton, Missouri, the seventh of 12 children born to a farmer who also served as an unpaid Baptist preacher. His father, James Cash Penney Sr., ran his household and his ministry with the same unbending sternness, a man who believed that comfort was suspicious and idleness was sin. There was no room in that household for waste, no patience for excuses, and precious little money to go around in the first place. The elder Penney did not draw a salary from his congregation, a point of principle that meant the family's survival depended entirely on the farm and on the discipline of every person in it, children included. By the time young James was 8 years old, his father had informed him that he was expected to buy his own clothes from that point forward, a lesson delivered not out of cruelty, but out of a conviction that self-reliance had to be taught early, or it would never be taught at all. It was an unusual, almost severe form of parenting, but it planted something in the boy that never left him, an instinct that a dollar unearned was a dollar not truly owned, and that thrift was not a hardship to be endured, but a kind of quiet virtue. The Penney household was also steeped in the language of the Golden Rule, the biblical instruction to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, repeated so often around that Missouri dinner table that it stopped sounding like scripture and started sounding like plain common sense. James absorbed it the way children absorb the things said around them every single day, without any sense that it was extraordinary, and it would later become the literal name above his first store's door and the philosophical spine of everything he built. He did not grow up dreaming of retail empires. He grew up wanting more than anything to be a rancher, and a bout of ill health as a young man pushed him west in search of dry air and open country, the classic prescription of the era for a weak chest. He landed in Colorado first, worked a series of modest jobs, failed at a butcher shop venture because he refused on principle to bribe a hotel chef with free whiskey to secure a meat contract, and eventually found his way into the employ of a small dry goods chain called the Golden Rule Stores, run by two Colorado merchants named Guy Johnson and Thomas Callahan. The name was not incidental. Johnson and Callahan had built their small chain of general stores around the same principle James had grown up hearing, that customers should be treated fairly, charged honest prices, and never taken advantage of through the shady tactics common among frontier merchants of the day. Tactics like extending endless credit that trapped rural families in debt, or marking goods up so steeply that a single sale could cover a month's overhead. Penney proved himself a gifted clerk and an even more gifted student of the business, memorizing inventory, studying customer behavior, and demonstrating an almost unnerving discipline about costs. Johnson and Callahan noticed. In 1902, they offered him something unusual for a lowly clerk: a one-third ownership stake in a brand new store they wanted to open in the raw, unglamorous mining and railroad town of Kemmerer, Wyoming, provided he put up his own capital and ran the place himself. Penney scraped together $1,500, much of it borrowed, and moved with his young wife Berta to a town that had exactly one thing to recommend it: a captive population of coal miners and railroad workers who needed dry goods and had nowhere honest to buy them. The first Golden Rule store opened its doors in Kemmerer in April of 1902, a modest wood-frame building stocked with work clothes, boots, bolts of fabric, and household basics. Its name painted plainly above the entrance as both an invitation and a promise. Penney ran it with a rigor that startled the town. He refused to extend credit, insisting on cash payment for every purchase at a time when nearly every rural merchant in America ran informal tabs for regular customers, a system that kept families perpetually indebted and stores perpetually exposed to bad debt. He kept his markups low, deliberately undercutting what customers had grown used to paying elsewhere, on the theory that volume and repeat business would more than make up for thinner margins. And he insisted, with an almost religious fervor, that every employee treat every customer, rich or poor, familiar or stranger, with the same unwavering courtesy. Berta Penney worked the store alongside him in those early years, and the couple lived so frugally above or near the shop that neighbors sometimes remarked on it, not realizing they were watching the incubation of a business philosophy that would eventually touch millions of American households. The Kemmerer store succeeded beyond what any of the three partners had expected, and within a few years, Penney was opening additional Golden Rule locations across small towns in Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and Colorado, always favoring the same kind of place: modest railroad or mining towns underserved by honest retail, where a fair-dealing store could win loyalty quickly and face little sophisticated competition. But what made Penney's approach genuinely novel was not just the storefront philosophy of low prices and cash sales. It was the way he structured ownership and management, an innovation that would later be remembered as the Penney idea, though at the time, it was simply how he did business out of necessity and instinct. Rather than hiring salaried store managers who had no real stake in a location's success, Penney recruited promising young clerks, often men he had trained personally, and made each one a minority partner in the store he would run, typically putting up a third of the capital themselves and taking a third of the profits. It was a structure that turned every store manager into something closer to an owner-operator, deeply invested in controlling costs, pleasing customers, and growing the business because their own household income depended directly on the store's daily performance rather than a fixed paycheck. This partnership model solved a problem that had bedeviled chain retailers for as long as chains had existed. How do you maintain quality and integrity across dozens or hundreds of locations run by people you cannot personally supervise every day? Penney's answer was to align incentives so precisely that supervision became almost unnecessary, because the manager standing behind the counter in a store 400 miles away had exactly the same motivation to run it honestly and efficiently as Penney himself would have had. He also insisted that every associate he trained internalize a specific ethical framework, later formalized into a set of guiding principles that emphasized fair dealing, quality merchandise, reasonable profit rather than maximum profit, and continual reinvestment in training people rather than simply extracting labor from them. He was, in effect, building not just a chain of stores, but a self-replicating culture, one designed to survive and multiply, even as he personally could not be present in every location. The growth that followed was remarkable for its steadiness rather than its speed, the mark of a man who distrusted overextension as much as he distrusted debt. Store by store, town by town, the Golden Rule chain expanded through the rural American West. Each new location typically opened only once Penney, or one of his trusted partners, had identified both an underserved town and a manager partner disciplined enough to run it correctly. By 1907, Penney had bought out the original founders, Johnson and Callahan, becoming sole owner of what was by then a chain of several dozen stores. And he began the process of consolidating and standardizing the operation under his own more codified version of the Golden Rule philosophy. The stores themselves remained modest by later standards, single-story buildings selling practical dry goods, work clothing, boots, and fabric to farming and mining families who valued durability and fair pricing over fashion or flair. But the underlying machine, the partnership model, the cash-only policy, the relentless focus on cost discipline paired with genuine respect for the customer was quietly proving itself to be one of the more sophisticated retail innovations of its era, decades ahead of the franchise structures that would later be celebrated as revolutionary when other companies adopted similar ideas. By 1912, the chain had grown to roughly 34 stores spread across half a dozen western states, and Penney, ever the meticulous planner, decided the operation had outgrown its informal structure. In 1913, he formally incorporated the business as the JCPenney Company, retiring the Golden Rule name from the corporate letterhead, even as its underlying philosophy remained stitched into everything the company did. The choice to put his own name on the enterprise was not vanity so much as branding logic mixed with personal accountability. Penney wanted his name attached to every transaction because he intended to be personally answerable, in reputation if not in daily practice, for how every store treated every customer. It was a small act with large implications, transforming a regional chain into a named institution. and it set the stage for the second and far more explosive phase of the company's growth, one that would take it out of the dusty frontier towns of the Mountain West and into the department store aisles and eventually the enclosed shopping malls of a rapidly modernizing America. The years following incorporation saw the company accelerate its expansion at a pace that would have seemed reckless to the young Penney of Kemmerer, though by then, the model had proven itself resilient enough to support faster growth without sacrificing the discipline at its core. Store counts climbed into the hundreds through the 1910s and 1920s, spreading eastward out of the original Western strongholds and into the Midwest, the South, and eventually the Northeast. And then, as the ambitions of the business plainly outgrew a regional headquarters, all the way to New York City, the undisputed capital of American commerce and finance. The move to New York in the 1910s was a symbolic as much as a practical decision, a signal that a company born in a Wyoming mining camp now considered itself a legitimate national player, capable of competing for capital, talent, and merchandise contracts on the same stage as the country's most established retailers. That relocation also coincided with a gradual but unmistakable evolution in what a penny store actually was. The dry goods emporiums of the early Golden Rule years, selling mostly work clothes, boots, and household basics to rural families, slowly gave way to something closer to a full-line department store, offering a broader range of apparel for men, women, and children, along with home goods, accessories, and eventually appliances and furniture as the century progressed. This transition tracked the broader transformation of the American economy itself. As a nation that had been overwhelmingly rural and agricultural in 1902, became, decade by decade, more urban, more industrial, and more oriented around a rising middle class with disposable income and rising expectations about quality and variety. One of the company's most consequential strategic decisions in this middle period was its embrace of private label merchandise, a move that would come to define its identity for the better part of the 20th century. Rather than relying exclusively on wholesale brands controlled by outside manufacturers, whose pricing and quality Penney could not fully dictate, the company began developing and manufacturing its own house brands, tailored specifically to the needs and price sensitivities of its core customer base. Towncraft emerged as the company's flagship menswear label, known for reliable, affordably priced shirts and basics that working and middle-class men could purchase without a second thought about durability or fit. Big Mac became the company's workwear line, offering rugged overalls, jeans, and jackets aimed at laborers, farmers, and tradesmen who needed clothing built to withstand real physical work rather than merely look presentable. These private labels, and the many others that followed across categories like women's apparel, children's clothing, and home textiles, gave the company something that pure resale of third-party brands never could: complete control over quality, cost structure, and profit margin, along with a distinctive identity that customers came to trust, the way they trusted the company's name itself. This period also saw the company make a decision that would prove equally consequential, though its full implications would not become clear until much later. The introduction, in 1959, of the JCPenney credit card. For decades, Penney had built his reputation partly on the refusal to extend credit, viewing cash-only sales as both a moral stance against trapping customers in debt and a practical safeguard against bad receivables. But by the late 1950s, the retail landscape had shifted decisively. Sears, the company's most formidable national rival, had built an enormously successful credit operation that not only drove sales volume, but generated substantial profit in its own right through interest charges. And department stores across the country were discovering that convenient in-house financing was becoming an expectation rather than a luxury among increasingly affluent, increasingly credit-comfortable American consumers. The introduction of the company credit card marked a genuine philosophical pivot from the founders' original cash-only doctrine, though it was framed, not incorrectly, as an evolution rather than an abandonment of the underlying customer-first ethos. The card gave shoppers flexibility and convenience, allowed the company to build detailed purchasing data on its most loyal customers decades before that kind of information became a standard retail asset, and, crucially, let the company compete on equal footing with Sears and the other national department store chains that had already made credit central to their business models. It also began quietly to introduce a kind of financial complexity into the company's operations that the founders' original vision had deliberately avoided. The decades following the credit card's introduction coincided with, and were substantially driven by, one of the most transformative developments in the history of American retail: the rise of the enclosed suburban shopping mall. As American families moved out of dense urban cores and into sprawling new suburbs throughout the 1950s and 1960s, developers began constructing massive, climate-controlled shopping centers designed around a handful of large anchor department stores that would draw steady foot traffic, with dozens of smaller specialty retailers filling the space in between. Being selected as an anchor tenant in one of these new malls was, for a retailer, both a mark of prestige and an enormously lucrative business opportunity, guaranteeing a built-in customer base and often extremely favorable lease terms in exchange for the drawing power the anchor brand provided. JCPenney, alongside rivals like Sears and Montgomery Ward, positioned itself aggressively as precisely this kind of anchor, and throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, the company opened hundreds of new full-line department stores, specifically designed and located to anchor the newest generation of American shopping malls. This mall era represented, in many respects, the pinnacle of the company's cultural and financial standing. Penney stores became a fixture of American suburban life, the place where millions of middle-class families bought school clothes each fall, work uniforms, wedding registries, home furnishings, and the small everyday necessities of domestic life. The company's sales climbed into the billions of dollars annually. Its stock became a staple of conservative investment portfolios, and its brand name became so deeply embedded in the vocabulary of everyday American commerce that being able to afford to shop at Penney's, rather than at a discount store, was itself a small marker of middle-class stability for many families. The private label strategy that had begun decades earlier reached its full maturity during this period, with Towncraft, Big Mac, and other house brands becoming genuinely beloved names in their own right, trusted across generations of the same families. But permanence is rarely permanent in retail, and the very forces that had propelled the company to such heights, its deep identification with a specific vision of middle-class American life, its reliance on physical mall locations as the primary vehicle for growth, and its increasing comfort with debt-financed expansion, were quietly sowing the seeds of the vulnerabilities that would trouble it for decades to come. The trouble did not announce itself all at once. It crept in gradually through the 1980s and into the 1990s, in the form of a slow and often self-inflicted drift away from the very customer base that had built the company in the first place. Retail analysts and business historians looking back on this period tend to describe it as an identity crisis, and the term is apt because the underlying problem was never a single catastrophic decision, but rather a sustained multi-decade uncertainty about who exactly the company was trying to serve and how it wanted to be perceived. Executives during these years, watching upscale department store rivals like Macy's, Nordstrom, and Bloomingdale's command premium prices and cultivate an aspirational, fashion-forward image, grew increasingly anxious about being perceived as staid, old-fashioned, or unfashionably middle market. The temptation to chase that more glamorous positioning proved difficult to resist, and the company began making a series of strategic moves aimed at elevating its fashion credibility, courting more upscale suppliers, redesigning stores to feel more boutique and less utilitarian, and gradually shifting merchandise mix away from the dependable, affordably priced basics that had always been its core competency. The trouble with this strategy was that it asked the company to compete on a battlefield where it had no inherent advantage. Macy's and its true upscale rivals had spent decades cultivating relationships with premium designers, building brand cachet through flagship stores in major urban centers, and developing genuinely aspirational marketing that Penney, with its deep roots in practical, value-oriented middle America, simply could not replicate convincingly. Every dollar and every hour of executive attention spent chasing that higher-end positioning was, in a very real sense, a dollar and an hour not spent reinforcing the value proposition that had made the company great in the first place. Dependable quality at a fair price, sold with genuine respect for the customer, exactly as James Cash Penney had insisted from his very first day behind the counter in Kemmerer. Loyal customers, particularly the practical, budget-conscious families who had shopped at Penney's for generations, began to notice a subtle but real shift in the company's self-conception, a sense that the stores were less sure of what they were supposed to be, caught in an uncomfortable middle ground between the discount retailers rapidly gaining share below them and the true upscale department stores they could never quite match above them. Compounding this drift in identity was a slower-moving, but ultimately even more consequential structural problem: the company's failure to adequately anticipate and adapt to the earliest waves of the digital retail revolution. For most of the 20th century, JCPenney had operated one of the largest and most successful mail-order catalog operations in the country, a business that, in many ways, prefigured the entire logic of e-commerce decades before the internet existed. The Penney catalog reached deep into rural and suburban households across America, offering the same breadth of dependable, private label merchandise available in stores, delivered directly to customers who might live hundreds of miles from the nearest physical location. At its peak, the catalog business was a genuine powerhouse, generating billions of dollars in annual revenue and representing one of the company's most important and profitable channels, a direct-to-consumer relationship that, in theory, positioned the company remarkably well for the eventual rise of online shopping, since it already possessed enormous logistical infrastructure, decades of direct mail customer data, and deep institutional experience selling merchandise sight unseen to customers ordering from a printed page. Yet that theoretical advantage never translated into practice. As the internet emerged in the 1990s and matured into a genuine commercial force in the early 2000s, the company was slow, hesitant, and underinvested in building out a serious online shopping infrastructure to match or extend its catalog legacy. Meanwhile, a new generation of digitally native competitors, most consequentially Amazon, began aggressively building exactly the kind of e-commerce operation that Penney, with all its catalog experience, might have been uniquely positioned to dominate. Amazon had no physical store legacy weighing it down, no decades of brick-and-mortar real estate commitments to protect, and no internal political battles between catalog, store, and emerging digital divisions competing for the same limited capital. It simply built, with ruthless focus, the online shopping experience that customers increasingly wanted, while Penney continued to treat its catalog as a legacy business, gradually declining in relevance rather than as the seed of a digital future it could have owned. The catalog's sales figures deteriorated steadily throughout the 2000s as customers who once flipped through its pages each season migrated instead to the rapidly improving, endlessly convenient world of online retail, much of it increasingly happening on Amazon rather than on any Penney-branded platform. The end, when it finally came, arrived with a certain grim inevitability. In 2009, after more than a century of continuous operation and after having been, at various points in its history, one of the largest mail-order businesses in the entire country, the company formally discontinued its catalog operations, closing the final chapter on a business line that had once seemed like an unassailable competitive strength, and had instead become, through years of underinvestment and strategic drift, a shrinking relic overtaken by nimbler digital rivals. Enclosed suburban malls, once the undisputed center of American retail life, started to face their own slow-motion crisis, as changing consumer preferences, the rise of big-box discount retailers and off-mall power centers, demographic shifts, and eventually the direct competitive pressure of e-commerce began eroding foot traffic at malls across the country, particularly the mid-tier and lower-tier malls where a significant share of Penney's store footprint was concentrated. The company found itself locked into hundreds of long-term store leases inside properties that were themselves declining in value and vitality, an enormous fixed cost burden that could not easily be reduced without either paying expensive lease termination penalties or simply absorbing the ongoing cost of operating stores in increasingly empty shopping centers. This real estate burden interacted dangerously with the company's growing reliance on debt financing, a legacy in part of the credit card era and in part of decades of acquisitions, store expansions, and shareholder-focused financial engineering common across corporate America in the 1980s and 1990s. Maintaining a massive physical footprint inside a declining mall ecosystem, while simultaneously lacking the kind of robust, well-funded digital operation that might have offset softening in-store traffic, left the company financially fragile in a way that was not always obvious from the outside during years when overall sales figures still looked respectable. The structural vulnerabilities were compounding quietly beneath the surface. A company increasingly resembling a grand old building whose foundation had begun to crack in ways not yet visible from the street, waiting for the kind of severe shock that would eventually reveal just how much load-bearing capacity had been lost. That shock arrived in 2011, though it did not come in the form anyone might have expected. The company's board, increasingly anxious about years of stagnant sales and eager for a transformative fix, turned to a man who had become one of the most celebrated retail executives in America. Ron Johnson, the former senior vice president of retail operations at Apple, widely credited as the architect of the Apple Store, one of the most successful and influential retail concepts of the modern era. Johnson had, in a relatively short span of years, helped build a store format that generated more sales per square foot than almost any retailer in American history, characterized by minimalist design, an emphasis on experience and brand immersion over transactional selling, and an almost cult-like devotion among customers who treated a trip to the Apple Store as something closer to an event than a shopping errand. When Johnson was announced as the company's new chief executive in 2011, the market reacted with genuine enthusiasm, and the company's stock price jumped meaningfully on the news, reflecting widespread hope that Johnson could work the same transformative magic on a struggling, century-old department store chain that he had worked on Apple's retail operations. Johnson arrived with sweeping ambitions and a genuine, if ultimately catastrophically miscalibrated, conviction that the company's core problem was not its financial fragility or its declining mall footprint, but rather an outdated, unglamorous shopping experience that needed to be torn down and rebuilt from first principles, much as Apple had done with consumer electronics retail a decade earlier. He assembled a team drawn heavily from Apple and other technology and luxury retail backgrounds, and he began implementing changes at a pace and scale that stunned even seasoned retail industry observers. Changes rooted in a philosophy that treated the company's century of accumulated retail wisdom, including everything its founder had instilled about pricing, promotions, and customer psychology, as baggage to be discarded rather than heritage to be respected. The single most consequential and ultimately most damaging decision of the Johnson era involved pricing strategy. For generations, the company, like nearly every department store chain in America, had relied heavily on a promotional pricing model built around frequent sales events, seasonal clearance markdowns, and a steady stream of discount coupons mailed and emailed to loyal customers. This model, while sometimes criticized by retail purists as artificially inflating regular prices only to discount them later, had become deeply embedded in how the company's customer base actually shopped. For millions of shoppers, checking the weekly sales flyer or clipping a coupon before a shopping trip was not an occasional behavior, but a core, expected ritual of how they interacted with the brand. Johnson, drawing on his experience at Apple, a company that famously never ran sales, never issued coupons, and maintained fixed, transparent pricing across its entire product line, concluded that this promotional pricing culture was fundamentally dishonest and inefficient, training customers to wait for discounts rather than trust the shelf price. And he moved to eliminate it almost entirely, replacing the old model with what he branded as everyday pricing, a simplified structure of straightforward, consistently lower prices without the constant churn of sales events and coupon clipping. The strategic logic was not, on its face, unreasonable, and similar arguments had been made by retail theorists for years about the inefficiencies and psychological manipulation inherent in traditional department store discounting. But the execution proved to be a masterclass in misreading one's own customer base. The company's core shoppers, cultivated over decades to associate real value with the ritual of finding a bargain, of waiting for the right sale, of feeling the small satisfaction of a coupon successfully redeemed, did not experience the new simplified pricing as a liberating gesture of honesty. They experienced it as the sudden, jarring removal of something they had come to value and expect, a psychological loss that no amount of genuinely lower baseline pricing could fully offset. Sales figures began collapsing almost immediately after the new pricing model rolled out, and the speed and severity of the decline caught even skeptical Wall Street analysts off guard. Compounding the pricing catastrophe was an equally dramatic overhaul of the physical stores themselves. Johnson envisioned transforming traditional department store floors, organized by broad merchandise categories in the conventional manner, into what he described as a collection of boutique-style shops within the store, each dedicated to an individual brand and designed with its own distinct aesthetic. Modeled loosely on the way, a shopping mall itself contained a variety of individually branded storefronts, but compressed into a single building. The vision called for dozens of these branded mini-shops to eventually populate every store, complete with distinctive fixtures, signage, and merchandising for each partner brand, alongside a rebranded central gathering space the company called the Town Square, intended to host events and community activities reminiscent of an old-fashioned town commons. It was an ambitious, expensive, architecturally striking vision, and remodeling stores to this new standard required massive capital investment at precisely the moment when the pricing missteps were already draining cash from the business at an alarming rate. The rebrand extended even to the company's own name and visual identity. Johnson's team unveiled a new, minimalist logo and began referring to the company in much of its marketing simply as JCP, dropping the traditional periods and capitalization of JCPenney entirely, a stylistic choice meant to signal a modern, streamlined, digitally native sensibility, but one that struck many longtime customers and industry observers as an oddly superficial gesture, more concerned with surface-level rebranding than with addressing the deeper substantive problems facing the business. The company's stock price collapsed, wiping out billions of dollars in shareholder value in a matter of months, and cash reserves dwindled rapidly as the business burned through capital funding. Both the failed pricing experiments lost revenue and the ongoing cost of the incomplete store transformation. The board, which had brought Johnson in with such enthusiasm barely a year and a half earlier, watched the unfolding collapse with mounting alarm. And by the spring of 2013, after roughly 17 months in the role, Ron Johnson was removed as chief executive, one of the shortest and most spectacularly unsuccessful tenures of any major American retail CEO in recent memory. The company's previous chief executive was brought back on an interim basis, specifically to stabilize the business and begin the painful process of reversing the most damaging elements of the Johnson strategy. A public reversal that amounted to a remarkable admission of failure for a company that had, less than 2 years earlier, been widely praised for its bold willingness to reinvent itself. The years following Johnson's departure were defined by a difficult, often unglamorous process of retreat and repair, as new leadership worked to methodically undo the most damaging elements of the failed rebrand, while simultaneously confronting the deeper structural problems that had made the company vulnerable to such a disruptive experiment in the first place. Coupons and traditional promotional sales events, so hastily discarded, were reintroduced, an implicit acknowledgement that the company's core customer base genuinely valued the psychological experience of finding a deal and could not simply be re-educated out of decades of shopping habit through executive fiat. The branded boutique shop store concept was scaled back significantly, with many of the partially completed remodels either abandoned or reworked into something closer to conventional department store merchandising. The JCP rebrand was quietly retired, with the company reverting to its traditional JCPenney name and more familiar visual identity. These corrective measures did stabilize the immediate bleeding, and sales figures gradually improved from their catastrophic Johnson-era lows over the subsequent several years. But stabilization was not the same thing as genuine recovery. The company emerged from the Johnson episode carrying substantial additional debt accumulated during the failed transformation, along with a permanently damaged relationship with a meaningful portion of its former customer base that had simply migrated to other retailers during the chaos and, for many, never fully returned. Leadership through the mid-2000s pursued a series of cost-cutting measures, store closures targeting the weakest performing locations in the most severely declining malls, and cautious investments in improving the company's long-neglected e-commerce capabilities, efforts that produced incremental improvement without ever fully closing the gap that had opened up against digitally native competitors and against traditional rivals who had themselves been investing more consistently and coherently in online retail. Throughout the years, the company had been consumed by the Johnson upheaval. Underlying all of these turnaround efforts was the same structural burden that had made the company vulnerable in the first place. Each incremental improvement in operating performance through the mid and late 2000s tended to be offset, at least in part, by the ongoing weight of interest payments and refinancing pressures, leaving the company in a kind of prolonged, precarious equilibrium, neither growing robustly nor collapsing outright, but never quite escaping the gravitational pull of its accumulated financial and strategic burdens either. It is worth pausing before returning to that unraveling to consider what daily life inside a Penney store actually looked like during the decades when the company was at the height of its powers. Because the texture of that experience explains a great deal about why the eventual rupture with customers felt so personal and so painful when it finally came. A trip to the local Penneys in the 1960s or 1970s was, for a great many American families, a genuinely anticipated ritual rather than a chore. Parents brought children in each August for the annual purchase of school clothes, an event substantial enough that some stores set aside dedicated fitting areas and extended weekend hours to accommodate the seasonal rush. Sales clerks, many of whom had worked the same department for years or even decades, knew regular customers by name, remembered their sizes, and could often anticipate what a shopper was looking for before being told. This dependability was not an accident or a byproduct of scale. It was the direct, intentional descendant of the partnership structure and cost discipline James Cash Penney had built into the company's bones more than half a century earlier, filtered down through generations of managers trained explicitly in his principles. The company reinforced this culture internally through what became known as the Penney Idea, a formal set of guiding principles that new employees were required to learn and that hung, often literally printed and framed, in stockrooms and break areas across the chain for decades. These principles emphasized serving the public to its complete satisfaction, expecting a fair remuneration for service rendered, rather than the utmost profit obtainable, and continually training employees so that they might have a fair chance to profit from their own progress and contribution to the business's success. Penney had never wanted his stores to be merely competent retail operations. He had wanted them to be moral enterprises that happened to sell dry goods and apparel. Institutions whose ethical commitments were not softened marketing language, but genuine operating constraints that shaped hiring, pricing, and daily customer interactions. In early 2020, the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the sweeping government-mandated lockdowns and non-essential business closures that followed in its wake across the United States dealt a blow to physical retail, unlike anything the industry had experienced in generations. Malls across the country shut their doors entirely for extended periods. And even after partial reopenings, consumer traffic to enclosed shopping centers remained severely depressed as public health concerns kept many shoppers away and accelerated an already ongoing shift toward online purchasing that the pandemic dramatically compressed into a matter of months rather than years. For a company already carrying substantial debt, already operating hundreds of stores inside mall properties whose long-term viability had been questionable even before the pandemic, and already lacking the robust digital infrastructure that might have allowed it to pivot quickly and effectively to online sales during a period of forced store closures, the pandemic did not create a new crisis so much as it violently accelerated the arrival of a crisis that had been building for years. In May of 2020, with revenue collapsing amid pandemic-driven store closures and with the company's already strained balance sheet unable to absorb the shock, JCPenney filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, becoming one of the largest and most prominent American retailers to seek bankruptcy protection during the pandemic era. joining a wave of storied retail names that buckled under the combined weight of pre-existing structural vulnerabilities and pandemic-driven disruption. The bankruptcy filing was, in a sense, the final reckoning for decades of accumulated strategic drift, financial overextension, and missed digital opportunity, the moment when all the slow-building pressures described across the earlier chapters of the company's history. The bankruptcy process, as is typical for large Chapter 11 filings, involved a complex restructuring of the company's debt obligations, the closure of a significant number of underperforming stores, and, ultimately, a change in ownership structure that would determine whether the brand survived at all or simply liquidated entirely, following the path taken by other once iconic American retailers that entered bankruptcy during this period and never emerged. In this critical moment, the company's fate came to depend heavily on an unusual rescue effort led not by a traditional retail operator or private equity turnaround specialist, but by two of the largest owners of shopping mall real estate in the country, Simon Property Group and Brookfield Asset Management. Both companies had powerful self-interested reasons to want JCPenney to survive as a going concern rather than liquidate, because the company remained an anchor tenant across a substantial number of the malls that Simon and Brookfield themselves owned and operated. And the sudden loss of an anchor tenant tends to trigger a cascade of negative consequences for a mall property, including lease clauses that allow other tenants to reduce rent or exit their own leases entirely when an anchor store closes, along with the broader reputational and foot traffic damage that comes from a mall losing one of its primary draws. In late 2020, Simon Property Group and Brookfield Asset Management completed a joint acquisition of JCPenney's operating business out of the bankruptcy proceeding, a deal structured specifically to keep the company operating as a going concern, preserving jobs, preserving the brand, and, not incidentally, preserving the anchor tenancies that mattered so much to Simon's and Brookfield's own real estate portfolios. It was, in many respects, an unusual and somewhat poetic turn in the company's long history. A retailer that had once been one of the most coveted anchor tenants in the golden age of American mall development, prized by mall developers precisely because its presence guaranteed foot traffic and commercial vitality, was ultimately rescued from extinction by two of the very mall landlords whose properties it anchored, a rescue motivated as much by the landlord's own commercial self-interest in preserving the value of their real estate holdings, as by any sentimental attachment to the storied Penney name. Under this new ownership structure, the company that emerged from bankruptcy was substantially smaller than the sprawling, debt-laden enterprise that had entered it, having shed a significant number of its weakest performing stores and having restructured its remaining debt obligations into something closer to a sustainable footing. Subsequent years brought continued ongoing efforts to modernize the company's operations, improve its e-commerce capabilities, and find a stable, sustainable competitive position in a retail landscape that had changed almost beyond recognition from the one the company had dominated during its mid-century peak. These efforts have continued into the present day, marked by incremental investments in digital infrastructure, continued rationalization of the company's physical store footprint, and various partnerships and initiatives aimed at reconnecting with a customer base that, while smaller and more fragmented than in decades past, has never entirely disappeared, a testament to just how deeply the brand had once been woven into the fabric of American middle-class life. A coherent lesson emerges, one that extends well beyond the specifics of any single company's history. The lesson is that a business built around a genuine, deeply held philosophy, in this case a founder's literal, unshakable belief in treating customers according to the golden rule, can sustain remarkable success across generations, precisely because that philosophy provides a stable core identity around which every other decision, pricing, merchandising, expansion, credit policy, can be organized and evaluated. But that same history also demonstrates how fragile such an identity can become. What remains today is a company operating at a fraction of its historical scale and influence, no longer the cultural institution it once was during the mid-20th century mall boom, but also, notably, not extinct, having survived a bankruptcy that claimed several of its once comparable department store peers entirely, propped up in its current form by the practical self-interest of the mall landlords who still need it to anchor their properties, and still, in whatever diminished capacity remains, carrying forward a name and a philosophy first articulated by a Baptist minister's frugal, ambitious son in a mining town general store more than a century ago.